Dr. Brown has allowed a website here to reproduce the answer to one of his answers to this objection about Jesus is not the Son spoken of in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. And so we left off 2 weeks ago reading these notes, which are available at this particular blog. And I think I put the link to this in the notes because reading the blog name is too difficult. But let me back up one paragraph so we can get a running start from where we left off 2 weeks ago. Speaking of the Targums, which are ancient Aramaic translations from the Hebrew into Aramaic, and these would have been available in the first century, and they would have been utilized by people who were attending synagogues, Jewish people who had difficulty understanding the Hebrew, the mother tongue of Judaism. It instead was the Aramaic tongue was being used along with Greek, right? That's why ancient Jewish people in the first century used both the Septuagint LXX, which is a Greek translation of the Bible, as well as you got closer to Jerusalem, where Hebrew and Aramaic were spoken more fluently, more prominently than the Targums would have been utilized. But the Targums are paraphrastic. They're not word-for-word translations. They're paraphrases. And so for that reason, they fill in a lot of details that the Hebrew version might not have. They fill in, there's some, like I said, it's a little bit of liberty taken where they're giving commentary on top of the text. But what Dr. Brown notices and highlights for us, and this is where we pick up our reading, this was already mentioned 2 weeks ago, but it's a running start. The Targum, while explicitly identifying this as a messianic prophecy, renders the verse in Aramaic with an interesting twist. Here it is, quote, "And his name will be called from before the one who is wonderful in counsel, the mighty God who exists forever, Messiah, because there will be abundant peace upon us in his days." And so that's Dr. Brown's somewhat wooden or somewhat literal translation. Now, Dr. Brown keeps interacting with the Targum. He says the problem with this translation, let me back up. Aside from the fact that the Targum names this child as the Messiah and not merely Hezekiah's son or someone like that, an earthly king that came along during the time when the prophecy was being given by Isaiah, which I maintain also needs to be within the context. We need to understand that the child spoken of can and should be an earthly king that Israel was looking forward to at the time. There's nothing wrong with that. Remember, many of the messianic prophecies find a partial fulfillment in whatever earthly or Davidic king was in rule at the time, and therefore they can have a partial fulfillment as this earthly king walked in part of the language that any given prophecy was detailing for the people. So I don't have a problem with that partial fulfillment, with a view towards the total and final fulfillment being done by Yeshua when he comes, or from their perspective, when he was going to come. From our perspective, he's already arrived, and yet still many of the messianic prophecies have not yet been completely filled up because we're still awaiting Yeshua's second coming. So, this is the best way to interact with Scripture. Yes, there's a partial near-term fulfillment, but this allows for us to realize that the prophecies could be speaking of an earthly king, but at the same time, they could be speaking of King Messiah, who was good to become the future. What did ancient Israel say? Sometimes they said, this is the earthly king, and other ancient rabbis and Torah teachers said, no, this is the coming Messiah. Well, the Targums, at least in this case, we're saying, no, this is the King Messiah. And when we turn to another resource that we're going to look at in time, we'll see that there's a way to interact with this passage where it's definitely King Messiah that the rabbis were speaking of, even though now we're only showing part 50-50. Dr. Brown says that the problem with this translation, aside from the fact that it is grammatically strained, is that almost all the names are heaped upon God, and only the last two are given to the Son. Although it is the naming of the royal child, it is in the naming of the royal child that is central in the verse. How odd, Dr. Brown says. Clearly the names refer to the Son, not to the Lord who gave them. All right, and that's where we left off 2 weeks ago. Now let's pick up on our new reading. Dr. Brown says, in other words, the Targumic rendering would be like saying, and God, the great, glorious, holy, wonderful, eternal, unchangeable Redeemer, King and Lord, calls his name Joe. No, we read this last week. I just remember. This is still recap. Therefore, I'm sorry, Dr. Brown says, there's no precedent, excuse me, there's no precedent or parallel to this anywhere in the Bible, and no logical explanation for this rendering, nor is it even a natural grammatical rendering of the Hebrew. All right, now we pick up the reading from where we left off 2 weeks ago, and this is brand new material. This is Dr. Michael Brown, Messianic Jewish apologist, speaking on Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, for unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given. Is this a human king? Is this King Messiah? Who is this speaking of? Here's what Dr. Brown has to say. Remember, he's going to take the Trinitarian perspective. The characteristics of the royal child are central, highlighted here by the names, not the characteristics of the Lord. As the brilliant Hebrew rabbinic scholar Franz Delitzsch noted, even Samuel David Luzzatto, one of the greatest of the Italian rabbis, rightfully observed that, quote, you do not expect to find attributes of God here, but such would be as characteristic of the child. Dr. Brown continues, this agrees with statements in the Talmudic and Midrashic writings, along with the comments of Abraham ibn Ezra, all of which state that the names refer to the child. So what we're noticing, what Dr. Brown is doing, first of all, is he's actually working primarily from the objections from the rabbinic perspective that this prophecy is speaking to Jesus or to God or to an earthly king. And what Dr. Brown is doing, first of all, is he's taking umbrage. He's providing the contrasted position, which is the Trinitarian position, that rabbinic Judaism teaches that the language, like the JPS showed us, the language is actually speaking to God. And that's how they primarily spin many of their translations. The Targum doing the same thing. Dr. Brown saying, no, the best way to interact with the passage is to read it in its most natural Hebrew, which is that it's referring to the child. Now, whether or not that child is an earthly king or whether or not he's a divine child, Dr. Brown hasn't said just yet. We're getting to that. We have to build to that, okay? Let's keep reading. Contemporary Jewish translations have done their best to come up with another solution. This is why I read those two versions out of the JPS. But none of the translations improves on the straightforward, obvious rendering found in most Christian versions. The JPS 1917 version that I read earlier avoids the whole issue, as you saw, simply transliterating rather than translating the Hebrew words. That's why I read them earlier. Let's keep reading Dr. Brown. The translation in the Stone Edition, which is another Hebrew version, it's written, it's produced for Jews by Jews. It contains, I've got a copy of it on my bookshelf here. It contains English on the right side of the page. I'm sorry, on the left side of the page. I'm sorry. Let's try that one again. If I remember, it's got the Hebrew on the right side of the page because you open it up there, and then it's got the English on the left side of the page. I don't want to go and grab it off my shelf to go look, but it's got Hebrew and English next to each other. And so what they do have is they have translation from the Hebrew, and that's what we're going to read about here. So according to Dr. Brown, the Stone Edition follows the Targum, and it reads, quote, for a child, explained in the footnote to be Hezekiah, for a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, and the dominion will rest on his shoulder. The wondrous advisor, comma, mighty God, comma, eternal Father, comma, called his name, Sadar Shalom, bracket, Prince of Peace, period. Okay, so that's similar to the Targum. Dr. Brown says, but none of these translations does justice to the clear meaning of the original text, and one could easily argue that once the clear meaning is avoided, the verse becomes difficult to translate. And I think he has a good point there. Let's keep reading Dr. Brown. The most imaginative translation is that of the NJPSV, the New Jewish Publication Society version. That's what NJPSV stands for, rendering the whole name as a sentence. And here we have it. You ready for it? No commas. Well, at least not very many. At least one. We got one semicolon and one comma there. quote, the mighty God is planning grace, semicolon, the eternal Father, comma, a peaceable ruler, period. All right, Dr. Brown says that this would be similar to, but substantially longer than, the name of Isaiah's son in Isaiah 8, 1-4, which in the Hebrew reads, Maher Shalal Hash Baz, which means hasten, pray, comma, speed, plunder, period. All right. Let's keep reading Dr. Brown. The problems with the rendering of the NJPSV are, and he's going to highlight what he thinks the problems are. Problem number 1. This is the very first time in the recorded history of the translation and interpretation of Isaiah that anyone has ever come up with this rendering, right? If, he says, the NJPSV is right, that would mean that in more than 2,500 years of reading and studying the text, no one else ever got it right. Got to kind of follow with that theology, right? Big problem. He continues, from the viewpoint of Jewish tradition, that would be almost unfathomable, since traditional Jews believe that the ancient rabbis were far closer to the original meaning of the biblical text, passing down their traditions and interpretations to the later generations who were more removed from the original. Right? So we don't, in Judaism, the idea is that the older and farther back you go in ancient Jewish writings, the more foundational you get. However, from their perspective, that's mainly true from the rabbinic commentary perspective and not necessarily from the textual perspective. Are you following what I'm meaning? So in Judaism, if you want to get some authority behind what you're saying, you quote the ancient rabbis who are commenting on the ancient text, rather than quoting modern rabbis who are commenting on the ancient text. He goes on to say, how then, this is Dr. Brown, how then could a traditional Jew believe that the Targum was wrong, the Talmud was wrong, the medieval commentaries were wrong, all other Jewish interpreters and translations were wrong, while a translation composed in the last third of the 20th century was right? Right? Okay. So that's one big glaring problem with the new Jewish Publication Society version. Point number 2, according to Dr. Brown, which is a problem with this NJPSV version, is that he says, point number 2, it eliminates the possibility of these 4 pairs of names being throne names similar to the custom in ancient Egypt, in which the new pharaoh would receive 4 royal names at his coronation, something many scholars believe to be the case here. And point number 3, the length of the name for the child seems completely unwieldy, even compared to the name Maher Shalal Hashbaz in the next chapter. All right. So he goes on to conclude that for all these reasons, the rendering of the NJPSV should also be rejected despite its ingenuity, whereas there's no good reason to reject the rendering found in many Christian translations, which gives 4 double names to the royal child, which we maintain as Trinitarians. Let's continue going, but we're winding down in this 30-minute study since we're running out of time. So I'm going to find a place to stop here momentarily. Shortly, I should say. Dr. Brown continues, that is why the translations of this passage in 2 recent commentaries by 2 highly respected non-fundamentalist scholars, Brevard S. Childs, a longtime professor at Yale University, and the Catholic scholar Joseph Blenkinsop, a professor at the University of Notre Dame for over 30 years. Both of these gentlemen follow this pattern respectively, and here they are. So first we have Child's translation, and then we'll have Blenkinsop's translation, and Dr. Brown reproduces both of them for us. First one, quote, for a child has been born for us, a son has been given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, comma, Mighty God, comma, Everlasting Father, comma, Prince of Peace, period. And then we have Blenkinsop's translation, quote, for a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, the emblems of sovereignty rest on his shoulders, period. His titles will be Marvelous Counselor, comma, Hero Warrior, comma, Eternal Father, comma, Prince of Peace, period. And Dr. Brown concludes by saying, as we noted above, these translations are in keeping with some important rabbinic traditions that also understand all the names to be those of the Messianic child. And I think what I will do is I'm going to stop right there in our answer. Park it like that so you can see it on your screen. And so next week we'll pick this up. We're still reading through Dr. Brown's answer to the common rabbinic objections to Jesus being the Messiah, but we're borrowing these notes because they're relevant to Messianic Judaism's and Christianity's opposition to both rabbinic Judaism as well as biblical Unitarianism. I myself am a Messianic Jew, but I'm also just a Christian. I say just in the sense that I hold to a lot of Christian theology that is articulated by your average Christian believer, even though I'm a Messianic Jewish believer and I have some differences in my practices as a Messianic Jew. My theology is the same as traditional Christian, Orthodox Christian, Orthodox with a small o, Orthodox Trinitarianism. So biblical Unitarianism likes to take the side of rabbinic Judaism over and against classic Christian tradition. Remember, Biblical Unitarian takes the Unitarian position, which is non-Trinitarian position, which is a minority position in terms of Christian positions. Historically, Christianity has largely been a Trinitarian outfit. Yes, there are non-Trinitarian groups that exist out there, and I flashed the names on the screens and on the screen in my studies here from time to time. Biblical Unitarian is not the only non-Trinitarian outfit out there. But for the sake of these studies, we're contrasting the Trinitarian perspective with their perspective. And in so doing, we're borrowing authors like Dr. Brown who take a Trinitarian position and show how the rabbinic tradition is a weaker position. And we're doing part of that because Biblical Unitarian takes the rabbinic position, and rather than attacking it, they seem to hold it up in a high, lofty position, rallying around the strict monotheism of the rabbinic Judaism and saying that this is what we should understand if we are to properly engage in our topics and discussions about God. But we'll see where this goes. But that'll do it tonight for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.